Hi, and welcome to today's FYN Virtual Learning Series session. So on with us, we have Rob McCleary and Jennifer Thorne, who are joining us from the Privy Council office. I would like to mention that I am coming to you from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I would also like to recognize that many of you are participating from other traditional territories all over the country. As we mentioned on the webcast on Tuesday, September 13th marked the 13th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on Thursday, the 13th of September, 2007. Marcella, if you can do me a favor of sharing the link in the chat to that declaration and news release, that would be fantastic. But certainly something we like to recognize with the Federal Youth Network is that we're all coming from different territories and traditional territories of different Indigenous peoples across Canada. Alors, à cette session, ça va être bilingue. Alors, on va avoir des questions en anglais et en français. Et puis, on va discuter de la rapport du greffier et puis qu'est-ce qui se passe pour créer ce rapport. So today is a really interesting kind of behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to create the Clerks Report, or in more formal terms, the 27th annual report to the Prime Minister, sorry, we'll see if I mess this up, 27th annual report to the Prime Minister on the Public Service of Canada, also known as the Clerks Report. If you would like to share any thoughts during today's webcast, you can do so either tagging the FYN account and using the hashtag Clerks Report or hashtag rapport du greffier. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. So we have Jennifer Thorne, who's with the Privy Council Office's Public Service Renewal Secretariat, and Rob McCleary, also with the Public Service Renewal Secretariat. So we'll get to our first question. So what led you to this current position? So maybe we'll start with you, Rob, and then go to Jen.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Josh. Thank you so much for opening it up with the land acknowledgement and for the discussion of UNDRIP. And for the question, for me, it's very important that we start the conversation that way. I'm Métis and I grew up in Manitoba. And so I wanted to share with you a bit about sort of how I found my way into the Privy Council office in Ottawa. Don't worry, I won't give you my full life history. I'll keep it fairly brief to the highlights. But I was actually recruited through FSWEP into Western Diversification in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I got to work with that organization for a number of years. And I think, what I found really engaging about that work was, in addition to being given some really interesting work and working with Manitoba's Indigenous communities, I was fortunate that I was able to spend some time in joining some networks. And so back many, many moons ago, I was actually the vice chair of the Manitoba Federal Youth Network chapter out there. I believe it's called the Future Leaders Network now. And that was an excellent way to engage with colleagues across departments to figure out what's going on. And we were talking about public service renewal back then too. And so those were important conversations. And I also joined the IPAC board, the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. And I mentioned that because it was actually through that connection that, I was able to, get identified and recruited into Ottawa, into the Privy Council office. And so, I joined these kind of networks just because I'm kind of nerdy, and I think, they do a good job of helping to make a difference. But, you never know what some of these connections can make. And, so it was, I think that passion for, trying to improve the public service, and there's networks that, really helped to land me in my current position with the renewal secretariats in the Privy Council office. And I think sometimes I reflect on it, and here I was a little kid growing up in rural Manitoba, and now, I'm able to advise, the Prime Minister and the Clerk of the Privy Council on, what we're doing as the, as a public service. So I think it's, it's kind of an awesome, institution and country that, you're able to do a lot of that work in. And I think, still a long way to go, right, on a lot of, on a lot of our renewal work and other aspects of our work too. It's a never-ending job. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jen, and I'm actually really happy that she's able to join me in this discussion today, because she also brings a lot of experience on our Beyond 2020 work that's so critical for helping to build the Clerks Report. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks very much to Josh and the Federal Youth Network for the invitation to join you yet again. I wanted to start off by saying that I got absolutely to where I am by religiously reading the Clerks Report on an annual basis, and actually it's somewhat true. So I'll get back to that a little bit later, maybe in one of the subsequent questions, but did want to kind of note the importance of it. Moi, je suis originaire d'une petite ville au Nouveau-Brunswick qui s'appelle Edmundston. Ceux qui connaissent les accents acadiens, vous allez peut-être reconnaître le mien. Donc, je suis Brayonne, je roule Meilleur, et je ne connaissais rien vraiment à la fonction publique fédérale. Et donc, ça a été vraiment un coup de chance que j'ai eu accès à une carrière dans la fonction publique du Canada à travers d'une expérience de travail d'enseignement coopératif. Donc, j'étais étudiante à l'Université d'Ottawa, j'étais inscrite au programme coop. Et j'ai eu un coup de cœur pour un poste qui était dans un ministère, dans une vocation qui m'intéressait. Donc, c'était avec les jeunes. Et me voilà, ça a parti ma carrière, et je suis là quelques années, même voire quelques décennies plus tard. Donc, j'ai travaillé, comme j'ai dit, dans la jeunesse, dans les programmes sociaux, à Sport Canada. Mais aussi, je pense qu'une chose semblable à Rob, c'est l'importance des réseaux. Moi, j'ai eu vraiment un coup de chance, mais un intérêt aussi dans mon premier poste d'être impliqué avec, je pense, le premier réseau des jeunes qui avait été établi dans la fonction publique fédérale. Donc, c'était Imagine, un ministère qui s'appelait à ce moment-là Ressources humaines et développement Canada. Mais depuis ce temps-là, j'ai resté impliquée non seulement avec les réseaux des jeunes, mais d'autres réseaux. Et j'ai moi aussi vu vraiment l'importance des connexions et des connaissances qu'on peut développer. Autant les connaissances dans la tête, donc les choses qu'on apprend, mais aussi les personnes qu'on peut rencontrer de cette façon-là. Puis, à un moment donné dans ma carrière, j'ai été bloquée parce qu'il y avait beaucoup de postes qui cherchaient une expérience au sein d'une agence centrale. Et donc, j'ai utilisé mon réseau de connexions que j'avais acquis au fil des années, et je me suis trouvé un poste au sein du bureau du conseil privé. Donc, au départ, j'étais dans les nominations du gouverneur en conseil et au Sénat, et depuis 2 ans maintenant, je travaille au renouvellement de la fonction publique. Donc, c'est un peu sur mon cheminement, puis comment je me suis retrouvée ici aujourd'hui devant vous pour parler du rapport du greffier. Merci. Back to you, Josh.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. And great to hear how both of you kind of built your careers and been involved in youth networks and young professionals networks. That's certainly a thing that we highlight throughout our sessions. Alors, je pense que le valeur de ces réseaux, c'est clair. Et puis, je pense que c'est important de voir comment vous pouvez utiliser cette expérience pour avancer votre carrière. So let's start with a bit of a softball question. So who is the clerk? Alors, qui est le greffier? On a le rapport du greffier, so we have the Clerks Report, but who is the clerk?
So I'll keep this response fairly brief, because I suspect I'll be able to get to sort of expand on what the clerk actually does. But great way to start the conversation off. So the clerk is Ian Shugart. And before he became clerk, he was actually deputy minister of a few different departments. So he was deputy minister of foreign affairs, he's deputy minister of employment and social development Canada, and he was deputy minister of the environment, and then of course had a number of other ADM and other roles in the public service before assuming those DM level positions. So the clerk, comes to us, I think, with a lot of public service experience and expertise in running, quite a few other fairly large portfolios and departments. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. And maybe we can expand a little bit on what the role of the clerk is. We know we have sort of different levels of our organization. So many of us are in positions as say team leaders or managers or policy advisors, and then we know there are a number of layers between us and the deputy minister. But then above that, we have these roles of deputy clerk and clerk of the Privy Council. So what are those roles? Like what role does the Privy Council office serve? What role does the clerk serve?
Okay, so I'll start by breaking that down into sort of two different parts. One is sort of what is the role of the clerk? And so the clerk actually wears three different hats. It's kind of interesting in our Canadian federal institution that we have these three hats that the clerk of the Privy Council, his full title is the clerk of the Privy Council and the secretary to cabinet. Nothing's ever short in government. And so he has a role of, he has the secretary of cabinet hat. And so that duty is, he actually gets to sit in on those cabinet deliberations, with the prime minister and ministers. And then he comes out of those meetings, and then he can task out what was decided in those meetings across the public service. And so he'd call up his deputy colleagues and sort of give some direction there. In another important hat that he wears is he's the deputy minister to the prime minister. And so that in that function, he kind of operates very similar to how a lot of other DMs would work, except that his minister just happens to be the prime minister. And so, you can imagine, sort of the issues that, would come to the prime minister are typically the ones that cut across, a lot of different departments, a lot of the urgencies, of the day. But also in that role, he does have a department called the Privy Council Office, that he plays that DM role for, and, would, sort of engage, with employees like, a regular deputy minister would. And then the third hat that he wears, and I think what brings us here today, is he's also the head of the public service. And so in that role, he's you can make a few different analogies for what it looks like. It can be kind of like a CEO of many different organizations, sort of providing that broad sort of view and vantage across the public service. One interesting aspect of the public service is that a lot of the actual authority for how work gets done is vested in the deputy minister heads. And so the clerk and Privy Council office actually don't have a ton of what we would call sort of more traditional legislative authority. If you want that kind of authority, turn to Treasury Board Secretariat or the Office of the Chief Human Resource Officer, or the deputy heads for that. But the clerk has, by virtue of being sort of in that role, and by PCO being sort of in that vantage point of being able to see into the Prime Minister's office, does a lot of work in terms of being able to move things forward based on sort of that based on that vantage point, and having that sort of moral suasion kind of argument, if I can put it that way. And so I just also wanted to touch briefly too on PCO as an organization is actually, when I first joined, I thought, PCO does largely the feedback on memorandum to cabinet, for departments, and, getting stuff into cabinet, doing the cabinet agenda. And that is sort of, the bread and butter, I think, of what PCO does, but it does so much more, We have our renewal secretary who's charged with, renewing the federal public service. And there's, we're a small but mighty team, I think, that's works off the good graces of many networks and departments to help advance that work. We have you know, an entire other side of our shop that works on senior level appointments, right? There's a whole national security arm of the Privy Council office, and, you know, on and on and on. So it's quite a dynamic and interesting organization. And, you know, and I can talk maybe a bit more later on about, you know, some of the specific, or if Jen wants to talk about some of the specific work that we do in our renewal secretariat. But I'll stop there and I'll see if Jen has anything to add, because I know she has some considerable PCO experience too.
Well, I thought I would make just a couple of comments. So the first one is, in the course of my career working in a previous department, we were having a going away party for our deputy minister, actually, at the time. And he was leaving our department to actually come to the Privy Council office, and he was going to be becoming I think he was going to be the associate deputy clerk, or anyway, so some sort of title that had clerk. And his wife made the comment to him at that point, you know, like, didn't you start your career as a clerk? Because clerk is typically one of the, you know, an entry level job. And so she had made the comment about, you know, how can you be a clerk and be the most senior public servant? But that is the terminology that is used. So that always kind of stayed in my mind about the use of the word clerk as the most senior public servant. But did just also want to reflect on the fact that within the Privy Council office umbrella, we have the clerk, we have a deputy clerk, but then we also have a whole slew of what we call deputy secretaries, which are actually deputy ministers in and of themselves within the organization. So we have a DM who is a deputy secretary for public service renewal and senior personnel. There's one on operations, there's one on governance, there's one on intergovernmental affairs. So for a relatively small organization, we have a very kind of high level of deputy ministers and an interesting kind of governance infrastructure. And also just wanted to touch on the point, as Rob had mentioned, and this was part of my kind of previous role, that the clerk is responsible for making recommendations to the Prime Minister on all of those senior level appointments. So your deputy ministers are actually appointed on the recommendation of the clerk to the Prime Minister. So that is part of his responsibilities as well as head of the public service. Mais sinon, Rob a fait un très bon travail à décrire le rôle du bureau du conseil privé.
Oh, merci beaucoup.
Awesome. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est le rapport du greffier? Et puis, pourquoi est-ce que c'est important pour les fonctionnaires de le lire? So what is the Clerks Report? And Jen, as you mentioned, you've read it, you know, throughout your career and found ways to make it important in your career. But what is it, and why should public servants feel that it's important to them?
So I'll start off by explaining what it is, and then, because I'm probably a bit biased, I'll hand it over to Jen to explain why folks might want to read it. But I wanted to, you know, just share with you what I think is a really interesting tidbit is, you know, in terms of what is the report, there's actually no formal requirements, you know, for the formats of the report. There's a little piece of legislation in this giant thing called the Public Service Employment Act that's literally about 3 lines long that says every year the clerk needs to submit to the Prime Minister an annual report on the state of the public service. And that's about it. And so from that piece of legislation, so how it's crafted, right, is, right, we think about, like, there's some convention there and some, you know, we look at, you know, previous reports, right, this is the 27th installment of them, but it's also, right, a reflection of the times. And really, at its core, it is an update from the clerk to the Prime Minister on the state of the public service. It's, you know, it's kind of in the title. But right, how that's talked about, right, can sort of evolve over time. And, you know, one of, I think, the, you know, the sort of what I think the perennial challenge of, you know, drafting the Clerks Report is it does cover an organization that encompasses over 280,000 employees across so many different departments and organizations across Canada, and also public servants, right, who work around the world. And so, right, sort of reflecting this huge diversity of our positions and functions and of the good work and of the challenges, right, that remain is, you know, I think that's, you know, one of our, you know, sort of ongoing, issues in terms of having to write a really good report. But it does, you know, talk about, right, give some recognition to some of the accomplishments and the work that has been advanced by the public service over that past year. And it does sort of also, it does look at, you know, identify some areas where we do want to put a bit more areas of focus. And it typically does have a tiny, you know, sort of forward-looking piece to give an indication of, you know, where we want to go. So that's kind of like what the report, you know, is or attempts to be each year. But I'd like to throw it over to Jen, because I'd like to know, like, why we should read this report.
Non, mais pour moi, ça a commencé. J'étais au ministère du Patrimoine canadien quand Alex Himmelfarb a été nommé greffier du Conseil privé. Et donc, pas longtemps suite à sa nomination, il y a eu un événement qui a été organisé avec du ministère du Patrimoine canadien avons assisté à cet événement-là. Puis c'est vraiment là que j'ai appris à connaître toutes les dimensions de ce que faisait le gouvernement en matière de renouvellement. À ce moment-là, l'initiative Au-delà de 2020, si on veut l'appeler, s'appelait la relève. Donc, ça fait plusieurs années où est-ce que le gouvernement essaie de rester moderne et de continuellement s'adapter au monde qui continuellement change autour d'elle. Et donc, c'est à ce moment-là que j'ai appris vraiment qu'il y avait l'existence de ce rapport-là. Et donc, c'est là que j'ai vraiment pris un intérêt. Puis je pense que dans la même capacité que c'est très important de lire notre rapport annuel sur le rendement de notre ministère ou le rapport, the departmental report or the departmental results, whatever they're called now, they keep changing names, but departmental report and departmental plan. I kind of realized that it's important for us to, because we do work as part of a unit that's part of a team, that's part of a directorate, that's part of a branch and a secretariat and a department, but there always is something bigger that we are part of, and it's important to understand that broader context and where we fit in that world and how we contribute to the achievement of the government agenda. As I was talking earlier, I was, you know, from a small town. I understood, you know, kind of politics and government generally, but I did not really understand public administration. And so I did become a bit more of a nerd or geek, as Rob qualified, in terms of developing an interest in terms of how the public service really is there to support the government in achieving its agenda and mandate for which it was elected. So, and I find that kind of that knowledge of where you fit in the world and how those various pieces connect together is really, truly important to have a successful career within the public service. So that's why I developed that interest, and I think it's important that everyone should read the Clerks Report.
That makes sense. And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump into, you know, back before I was with PCO and working at WD out in the region, I often use the Clerks Reports, you know, as a way to advance, right, some of the changes that we were trying to make. And so, right, it tends to be a fairly high level document, which actually means you can hang a lot of different things onto it. And so, you know, sometimes we're like, well, we need to like try out this new process or new way of doing things. And I'd be like, yeah, exactly. Because right here in the Clerks Report, it says we need to be more innovative when we serve Canadians. And so then it becomes not just, you know, Rob trying to push something forward. It becomes, well, you know, the clerk seems to he's probably okay with this. So, you know, right here in the report. And so I think that's, you know, I would encourage people to, you know, read the report and look at it from those opportunities too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think our colleague, Jen McDougall, sort of highlighted in a tweet a couple days ago that, you know, this is to some extent the report card on the public service. This is, you know, here are the key things that have gone on over the last year and why, you know, you should care about it. So whether you're in, you know, a regional office or whether you're in the National Capital Region or in a department or an agency, you can find where, you know, where those priorities are going and where they've gone over the last year, where they're going over the next few years. So I guess in terms of this year's report, so we see that the format is a little bit different. Do you want to talk about that? Alors, pour cette année, le rapport a un peu d'un format un peu différent que les années auparavant. Alors, pourquoi est-ce que c'est un peu différent cette année?
Excellent question. So like I had mentioned before, there is some convention that is built up over years in terms of, the general ideas of what goes into the report. But the report is also very much a reflection, right, of the times that we're in. And so this year, right, unfortunately, we are in these COVID response times. And so I wanted to, because this is a behind the scenes look at the Clerks Report, I did want to share, some of our thinking and some of our decisions that were made in terms of drafting this year's Clerks Report, because it is, obviously, it is a much shorter document. It is in the form of a letter to the Prime Minister, whereas right in many of our previous years, it was typically a letter to the Prime Minister and then sort of your more traditional kind of report and then some annexes on there. And, you'll see that we have retained, right, the data annexes on there, but, sort of took a lot of, right, sort of the meat out of that, sort of the more formal reporting part of things. And so sort of three big considerations for us in, choosing sort of this path forward on the Clerks Report was, and in no particular order, one was like looking at sort of our resources. And so it is a small group that, tends to draft the report. But there is a considerable, input and resourcing on our communications side of things. And so I want to really recognize that, there's, we have sort of our little tiny writing area that does the writing of it, but then in terms of putting it into a PDF document, putting it into HTML, doing all of that formatting that I don't have an appreciation for, but that I gained actually a lot of appreciation for by working closely with my comms colleagues. That is a lot of work. And, anytime we make changes on it, they, very graciously, I think pull out their hair a bit, but then say, of course, we can make changes, and it ends up being a lot of changes. So I share that because this year, of course, our PCO communications colleagues, they were quite busy with being pulled in many directions, not the least of which were, helping to get a lot of very important messaging out on our COVID response. And so we wanted to factor in what is reasonable, right, from our own resourcing perspective in terms of, drafting the report. We also considered, right, the tone that would be appropriate. And that's where it was a really, I think, fine balancing act between we wanted to absolutely recognize the tremendous work that has been done, and discuss some, I think, really critical, important themes of the reports, but also be very mindful, right, that at the time that it was being drafted, and even when it was being released, that, we're in the midst of a really, really serious, right, global health crisis, and that there's a lot of very serious economic spillovers on that. And that, the report is a public document, and we're releasing it right when, like a lot of Canadians are, right, they're losing their jobs. They're, struggling to keep their businesses running. And so trying to think through, right, how that, would play out in that larger environment, was certainly a very important consideration for us. And then, then looking also at the content of the report. And so, like was discussed, the report is very much a back-looking document, right? So it has a pretty hard cutoff date of March 31st. And so if you've been around in government for a while, you'll understand the importance of that March 31st date. And so, you know, in terms of it was interesting. So in terms of the COVID response, there was about 4 weeks of super, super intense, I think, public service work that was in advance of that March 31st date. And, you know, we were able to there's a tremendous amount of work that the public service undertook prior to COVID, you know, hitting us, and that, you know, in many cases, those services still continue. And so we wanted to, you know, try and strike that balance there. And so that was, you know, some of our internal decision making in terms of how we, you know, how we arrived at this document. And hopefully people find that interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, from reading it myself, I think it struck that good tone of, you know, flagging that we are heading into very uncertain times. And it is a challenge to do that when we have, you know, that 4-week period of dealing with COVID. And then, you know, I think when we look back to, you know, where we were at in mid-March, you know, lots of us thought that, you know, within, you know, 3 to 5 months, we'd be resuming our normal lives. And certainly that hasn't been the case. But Jen, over to you. Other thoughts?
Yeah, all I was going to comment on is having read the Clerks Report for many, many years, there has been some of that ebb and flow. I'd say that traditionally, when I first started reading them, they did tend to be much more kind of conservative. And kind of low-key in nature. C'est vraiment dans les dernières années qui sont devenus un peu plus fancy, puis avec des dessins, des photos et tout ça. Mais je pense que ça sont souvent un testament de l'environnement dans lequel ils sont produits, puis l'événement dans lequel ils rapportent. Donc, je pense que c'est approprié qu'il y a des changements compte tenu du contexte et de l'environnement dans lequel ils sont publiés.
Oui, certainement. Alors, la prochaine question, il y avait une allusion à de nouvelles approches que le gouvernement pourrait vouloir continuer. Avez-vous une idée de ce que cela pourrait inclure? So there was a hint of new approaches that the government might want to continue. Do you have a sense of what those might include? Sorry, that's a fairly broad question.
It's yeah, it's a very astute question, though, actually. And I'm going to do like the high level answer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jen to give like a better answer. So give you some advance warning, Jen, that yeah, hopefully you can provide a bit more granularity. But you know, so I'll answer it kind of again in 2 parts. You know, so like at a very general and high level, you know, I think there's, you know, some recognition that there are some approaches that we've actually abandoned that we actually might want to return back to. And some of those, you know, things could be like our records management, some of our rights admin processes and procedures, and right, some of those other things that, you know, just really keep us functioning as teams, as units, as departments, and as a public service that, you know, we have maybe had to set aside right in these, you know, in these sort of virtual working times. But maybe I think there's also potential, right, to return to some of those, maybe even in newer, better ways. So that's one aspect that I wanted to certainly get out there for people's consideration. But the more sort of positive and more exciting area is, you know, I think there is a lot of potential that, you know, we have seen the design and the delivery of programs happen so quickly and rolled out so quickly, and then being adapted after they've been rolled out sort of in real time is like, I think that's a really interesting model, right? I think there's a lot of interesting models around, you know, how quickly we've got things approved. And I think in terms of our flexibility of work arrangements, like I think it's been said many times, not, and I think, you know, we've demonstrated that you know, it can be done. And I think as we do it more, we're discovering more and more better ways of doing that. You know, but what I'll say is there is no official list of these are the activities we want to keep. These are the ones we need to go back to. This is where, you know, like, I think we're really reliant on, you know, the public servants in line departments, the federal youth networks and the national managers communities of the world to help advance some of those conversations and to identify some of those activities. Like, I think, who am I in PCO to say, like, this is the definitive thing that needs to move forward? That's not a very good way of operating. And so that line in the report was meant to convey that in a very broad sense. You know, I think we recognize that there are these pockets of activities that, you know, and promising practices that we might want to keep or modify a bit as we move forward. But, you know, I don't know, Jen, you do like tons of outreach and engagement work, and you get to talk to like real people in departments. So
yeah, I get to talk to real people all the time, but I wanted to, and I see a bit of the comment about kind of risk in the chat, and certainly even particularly since I've been in public service renewal, but this has been kind of a language that we've heard for a long time, is this risk aversion in government and wanting to kind of eliminate all risk. And I think it's the kind of the environment that we've traditionally lived in. We're in a society, you know, we work and serve the government. We want to, you know, not embarrass the government. We want to spend prudently. We don't want to find ourselves in front of parliamentary committees, you know, responding to things that went awry. So people try to eliminate risk as much as possible. And we've been in these environments where that just, you know, what was impossible. So I've heard stories, you know, from the ADM and the deputy, or the ADM of HR, the head of HR at the CRA, as well as their deputy commissioner, talking about, you know, their call centers, and never in a million years would they have accepted, coming back to Rob's point, you know, of having people working from home. And lo and behold, you know, over the course of a couple of weeks, they were all working from home, and actually being to a certain extent more effective and more efficient and productive in doing that. So I think it's turned a lot of people's kind of minds around, and we talk a lot in Beyond 2020 about mindsets and behaviors, and we've seen that kind of forced mindset shift where people have just been able to realize avec le secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor qui met en place toutes les règles et les façons de faire. Eux aussi ont dû assouplir les règlements et les politiques pour permettre à donner des services aux Canadiens et être capable de répondre à l'environnement. Puis je pense que, une discussion aussitôt que ce matin, ils sont en train de regarder quel a été le résultat de où il y a des choses, des vis qu'il va falloir resserrer parce que peut-être on les a desserrés un peu trop juste dans le contexte à cause de l'environnement. Donc, je pense à l'avant-plan des choses que beaucoup de gens considèrent. It's interesting because in 2018, actually coming back to the usefulness of the Clerks Report, I used it as part of my rationale for negotiating because I moved to a full-time telework arrangement in 2018. And I referenced the Clerk Report, my rationale, to my big boss about why, you know, they needed to support it. But at that time, though, the honesty is that I used it, but I did need to take a demotion. It was a voluntary demotion, but I needed to do that to be able to telework full-time. And now we're seeing that kind of approach being reconsidered pretty significantly, and I think a much more openness to accommodating and adapting where work permits it. To having a more kind of dispersed workforce. And I think that has some great advantages in terms of being able to kind of recruit talent from more geographically diverse locations and having a workforce that is truly representative of our population, not just in these pockets of where the Government of Canada owns real property footprint. Donc, je pense que ça présente vraiment des occasions d'être capable de travailler des places où est-ce qu'on est capable d'être les plus efficaces et les plus productifs. Donc, je pense qu'il va y avoir du positif qui va sortir de cette expérience qui n'est pas nécessairement très positive.
Yeah, absolutely. To steal a line from Hamilton, the world will never be the same, right? There's probably not going to be a day in the future where 99% of the public service is in the office on a given day. It doesn't seem likely to happen ever again. But good to kind of leave that open in terms of the language on what's gonna happen in the future in the public service. We'll do one more question and then go to any questions we have from the audience. And just to mention again, Feel free to pose questions in the language of your choice, so either using the chat function or the Q&A function. Alors, tu peux utiliser la fonction chat ou la fonction de questions et réponses sur l'application Zoom. Et puis, and we'll pose those to our panelists. So one final question for you. So what is your highlight of working on this file? Alors, quel est l'enjeu de travailler sur ce dossier? Peut-être pour cette année ou pour plusieurs années. So this year or over the last few years, what are the highlights for you?
So for me specifically, to the Clerks Report, and I've had the fortune of also supporting my colleagues on working on a few of the past annual reports as well. So for the public servant nerd in me, it's kind of heartening that, you know, I get to be sort of a small part of that, you know, very broad documentation that will, you know, sort of record the history of the public service. You know, but something else is, and I'd say this is applicable to the Clerks Report, but also applicable to, you know, our work in public service renewal and working on Beyond 2020. And something that's been like personally motivating, I think, throughout my career as a public servant is having that impact and being able to see, right, the positive change that, you know, we have on the lives of Canadians. And, you know, I think like the Clerks Report, I think it's a very indirect way of getting at that impact. But, you know, I'm really hopeful that, you know, folks on this video chat will use the report to like continue to make that impact for us that we need to make, right, some of those changes. Being able to have the privilege of getting involved in some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I'd say for me, it's similar to Rob, getting that kind of insider's view is always, I feel like kind of a privilege to have that opportunity. And in the kind of public service renewal Beyond 2020 file specifically, you know, I'm a people person and I love the fact that I get to interact with my colleagues and public servants from across the country. Donc, j'ai la chance de transiger avec des gens comme Josh et Jen et Marcella et d'autres gens de d'autres communautés à travers le pays, avec les conseils fédéraux régionaux. Venant d'une région de façon originale, je me suis retrouvée à Ottawa, mais je n'étais jamais une personne qui pensait qui passait toute sa vie à Ottawa. Donc là, je suis contente d'être revenue dans une autre région et de pouvoir servir mon pays de ce plan-ci. Et aussi, je pense que c'est important encore, j'ai travaillé à l'École de la fonction publique parce que je trouvais que c'est important d'aider mes collègues à mieux comprendre la fonction publique et être efficace dans la fonction publique. Puis l'idée que je suis maintenant au centre où est-ce que je suis capable d'influencer aussi la direction, le mandat, l'agenda du gouvernement en matière de l'appui qui est offert aux fonctionnaires, ça me fait chaud au cœur et je suis contente de pouvoir contribuer de cette façon-là.
Awesome. So we'll go to a question that was in the chat. This is from Chennai, who says, thank you for the session. I've looked forward to reading the Clerks Report each year since I joined the Federal Public Service. Jen mentioned that we should each read the Clerks Report, just as we each read our individual departments, departmental plan and departmental results report. Just to mention, I think it's probably like 1 in 100 people who read their department's departmental results report. But is there an equivalent of a plan for the clerk as well? Is it available publicly, or is it only the report to the Prime Minister that is published online? So I guess looking at like, what are sort of the forward-looking documents that kind of come out of the Privy Council office and the clerk?
Do you want to start, Rob, or do you want me to go?
Doesn't matter. You want to take that one, I can jump on.
Okay, perfect. So I'd say that the Clerks Report does do part of that, like forward setting to a certain extent. Again, it's a portion, a chapter, if I can call it, traditionally, of the report, whereas the majority of it is backwards facing. There's a slight portion that is more forward looking. The Privy Council office as a department in and of itself has its own departmental plan and departmental results document. And then there's a series of other documents that would get published from the perspective of a public service in terms of kind of giving a bit more of the forward looking, but I'd say we tend to be much more kind of backwards looking. So there is not another one as far to my knowledge that is, kind of published by the clerk in that kind of concept. That being said, however, we are very closely aligned, and other things that you can look to in terms of kind of knowing where the government is going, things like the speech from the throne that will be taking place next week, certainly sets out the government's agenda, and then the government and public service has to, kind of respond, realign, reassess its plans, and make sure that we are well positioned to be able to support the achievement of what's set out in the speech from the throne, which would be followed by budget and all of those things that you may learn in another session. And typically those the speech from the throne would be kind of set out from whatever the government had set out in its kind of election platform. So those are all little things that I have learned, come to learn through my career in the public service that are important to watch. If you've had the opportunity of working in a department, I've had a couple of occasions to do this when there is an election. There will be kind of transition materials that will be prepared. So you will, have, if you get the chance to do that type of work, you get to kind of look and analyze all of the different party platforms, and within the mandate of the organization that you're in, assess, if it's a conservative government, this would be kind of the and NDP. So all different things that kind of help to set out the agenda and how the public service kind of aligns itself and to best support and reach and achieve the mandate that what the government was elected to deliver.
Absolutely. Rob, other thoughts?
I mean, that's really, really fulsome answer. I would just, quickly add on that, for looking at sort of the direction of the internal public service, I'd make a good argument that our Beyond 2020 renewal framework is a good way to get that direction there. We've actually been purposely deliberate in not actually producing a ton of documentation for that. Wanted to take a bit more of a, customizable approach for organizations to move that forward. And so, really helping to advance, right, sort of more of a conceptual framework, again, that people can move forward on, making us more agile, more inclusive, and better equipped. And then, if there's specific files that you're working on too, there could be a plan or something that, is helping to provide some coherence on that, right? So I think digital and data and so on, right, would have, their own, sort of strategies that you could, look into there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's been a key success factor for Beyond 2020 compared to Blueprint 2020 or previous initiatives, is focusing around those kind of big picture pieces that departments can take and then apply to their department, as opposed to having a sort of not cookie cutter approach, but having very specific metrics that may not work for every department. Because I think that that's harder for people to kind of see themselves in. And Beyond 2020, I think with the mindsets and behaviors is really a much easier way for people to see themselves and see their department and see what needs to kind of advance, even linking those up with public service employee survey results and being able to really see, what's the culture change that needs to happen, what's the mindset change that needs to happen at the management level, at the employee level.
Yeah, I was just going to make a funny comment, Josh, as you were talking, and thankfully kind of recognizing your appreciation for the flexibility, because, when we were developing, the frame, and everyone's like, we want to be more innovative. And then we're like, okay, you want to be more innovative? And they're like, okay, well, I need to give a plan. Where's the template? And we're like, we can't be innovative if we give you a template. So it's some of these mindsets that we do need to kind of work on and shift and kind of give that flexibility for that more for the departments and communities to be able to customize to their realities, and so that it is meaningful and relevant to whichever organization is trying to affect that change. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rachel had a comment and then question. So her comment was starting with Destination 2020, then Beyond 2020, with having an agile, innovative, and equipped workplace. Never could we have imagined what happened in 2020, but kudos to your team for holding this crystal ball. So how do you foresee the future as it is happening now?
Wow.
I'll leave this one to you, Rob.
Wow, that's a hard question. So I feel like any of us on this call would be equally equipped to provide a really interesting answer on there. And I think just by virtue of us having the platform will, provide, some of our perspective on that. One thing as I was getting prepped for this discussion was, I was thinking about the past clerks reports. And it's interesting, if you want to go down a historical journey, you can actually find all the clerks reports online, and you can, you don't have to read them all, but you can like go back and you can kind of read a sampling throughout the decades. And one thing that really struck me when I was reading them was a lot of the core themes actually stayed the same. So we were talking about diversity and inclusion back in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s and now. And we're talking about how do we better serve Canadians throughout that same period of time. What was different though was the how. The how was very different. And so, right, like we were, talking about, wow, like we have all these service kiosks now throughout the country, back in, I think, the late 80s and early 90s for service delivery. And now it's very much digital, and now it's very much, right, co-creating stuff with Canadians. So if I had to guess on like where we're going in the future, I think some of the core fundamentals of, service delivery will always be there. Building an institution that is, inclusive and that is reflecting the Canadian population, and that is able to, right, provide that environment where we're equipping public servants so that they can provide that service to Canadians and advice to government in the most effective way. I think those are like some core themes that if we're reading a clerk's report 50 years from now, will probably still be in there, but we'll be talking about them in very different ways. So I'm not sure if that's a very good answer, but I'll see if Jen has something.
No, I think that's great. And coming back to kind of reading previous clerk's report, I had a colleague who had worked kind of in a different lifetime in this type of work at the Privy Council office, and he had done a bit of a research of the last 50 years of public service, and had said that we go in these 5-year cycles typically, but that when we were talking about some of this renewal, again, the same kind of vocabulary and dialogue when they were bringing in typewriters and computers, and how those were going to just transform how we were serving Canadians and how we did our work. So it's a different kind of thing that we are certainly adapting to now. And I, again, in the role that I have now, privilege of dealing with lots of different interesting people. And this morning, very early actually, had a call with folks from Brazil, Holland, France, Australia, and I'm forgetting another one, but anyways, and they're all working on essentially similar things. I think everyone is really focused on seeing how we have all adapted and changed, and using this as an opportunity, and kind of really embedding those things that have been positive about this change, learning from them, and continuing to push forward. So we're not alone in this reflection and striving to do better, and I think that we are going to continue to try to work to be that world-class, top of the line public service that serves Canadians now and into the future.
Absolutely. And I think from the crystal ball perspective, I think it's interesting if you look back to, as you were mentioning, the 2018 clerks report sort of flagging, working remotely, and lots of these trends you see sort of flagged in an earlier report. And then they become more prominent as the years go on. So something that was a pilot project 5 years ago might now be, a full-fledged, department or division of a department, or something that has hundreds of millions of dollars of funding has become a really big priority. I think that's some of the crystal ball element of, what you'll see in the report, like, programs like the free agent program that started with, a free agent or half a dozen free agents. Now have 80, 90, 100 people. Different things that are flagged throughout the years really are looking at, programs that eventually get expanded, eventually become, bigger priorities than they were initially. So I think that's some of the value that I've seen in the report over the years, is really, highlighting those things that you don't know about, and can get kind of a taste of, what's coming in the future that way.
Yeah, and I would just add on quickly that I'd say there's actually no magic behind that. It's, due to the hard work of actually talking right to the people doing that real work. and then listening and, you know, sort of hearing where things are going, and then trying to figure out where things are going right from there. So that's kind of how we kind of figure out some of those things.
No, and exactly. And I might just make a bit of a pitch if people are not familiar with a group within the federal public service. It's called Policy Horizons. There's groups like that do exist, and they have a public website that does they do foresight research, and they kind of anticipate some of these trends and where the world and where our government is going. So if you have some time and kind of curious to read, just look up Policy Horizons, and you can see a bunch of their research there, and reach out to the people that work there, because they're your colleagues as well, and who do some of this thinking. So just one example of kind of where we harness and get some of that advanced intel, and kind of just reflecting on my own experience. I remember when I made the decision, I would travel a lot back and forth between Ottawa and where I live now in Mont-Tremblant. And I remember driving and thinking, oh my God, have I just made like the biggest mistake of my life? Have I just stalled my career completely, and I'm going to be, kind of stuck in a hole for the rest of my life. But, again, you never know. Little did I know, I kind of hoped that one day we would be in this world where kind of working from anywhere might be accepted more widely, and never imagined that a pandemic would lead to it. But I think that that what I had kind of appreciated and realized then, I think a lot more people are appreciating now. So.
No, I think certainly, like as we go into the fall and we go into things like the innovation fair or the next Clerks Report, it'll be really interesting to see how departments have individually kind of adapted to these times. I think we see different departments saying we're not going back to the office even when we can. It's going to be remote by default, and I think it'll be really interesting to see sort of what that next report looks like, and where really we're going as a public service in kind of a post COVID world. So a huge thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts and sharing your experience today. I think this was a really interesting look at behind the scenes of how this report gets built, of who the clerk is, what it is that they do, and really how they shape, and how the Privy Council office helps to shape the public service as a whole going forward. Alors, merci à Jen Thorne et puis à Rob McCleary pour nous joindre aujourd'hui pour partager leurs pensées et leur expérience en créant le rapport du greffier et en travaillant avec le secrétariat du renouvellement de la fonction publique. So thanks very much as well to everyone for joining us today online from across Canada. I see a number of our folks who tend to join from different regional offices all over the country, and I think really over the last 6 months, I think it's been a tremendous opportunity for the public service to show how agile, equipped, and inclusive we can be in creating a public service that work can happen anywhere, and life goes on for the public service of Canada. So thanks very much everyone for joining us today, and we'll add the links in the chat to the wiki, which will list our upcoming sessions. Next week we have another session with Flex GC, and many interesting learning opportunities coming up for you over the next 6 weeks, and really into the fall and into the winter. So so thanks very much for joining this FYN virtual learning series session on behind the scenes creating the Clerks Report. Have a great day, everyone. Merci à tous, et puis bonne journée à tout le monde.
Thank you.